Good morning. This is Brian Ray, and I'm coming to you from Stone Mountain, Georgia. And it's time for this week's online Bible study. And this week we're going to be in the Gospel of John, John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. We're going to be looking at the episode of Jesus walking on the water. So this is going to be Jesus walking on the water. John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. Let's start off by reading this text. It says, "When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. But now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3.5 miles, when they had rowed 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading." So that's John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. So in the text today, we have the fifth sign recorded in the Gospel of John. If you remember, John has a total of 7 signs that he records. Some people call them miracles, but John calls them signs. So we have the fifth sign recorded in the Gospel of John. And remember, John did not report these to us for us to be amazed by the miraculous, but to teach us a spiritual truth. And so there was a spiritual truth we were to learn behind each one of these signs. And the spiritual truth we may learn from this sign, the one that we're going to be looking at today, this fifth one, the spiritual truth we may learn from this one is that Jesus comes to us in our trials when we least expect him. Jesus comes to us in our trials when we least expect him. And so this story begins by sending the disciples away. So look at John chapter 6, verse 16 and 17. It's going to start by Jesus sending the disciples away. Listen to what it says in verses 16 and 17. It says, "When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum." So when evening came, the disciples got in the boat and they set off for Capernaum. But then listen to what it says also in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. This is where Matthew talks about this exact same story. It said, "Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd." Then verse 23, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And so, but note this, how in the Matthew text, Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, notice what Jesus said. Verse 14, 22, he says, immediately Jesus made, notice it says, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. So Jesus made them get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. You know, why would Jesus do this? Why did he make them get into the boat? Jesus wasn't getting ready to leave at that point, but he made his disciples leave. So why was he doing that? Jesus does this because the people were getting wrapped up into making him a king. Remember we saw in verse 15, remember what it said in verse 15 of John chapter 6? Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. And so Jesus understood the people were all excited and the people were all getting wrapped up in, we're going to make this man our king. We're going to make Jesus our king. He's fed us just like Moses fed them in the wilderness, and we're going to make this man our king. And so he knew that's what the people were thinking. And he also knew that the disciples could be caught up in that excitement too. Even though the disciples, they were his followers, they followed him and they knew him better than the crowd did, but yet they could get caught up in that same excitement of, man, let's make this man our king. Let's set him up as the king of Israel. For they didn't always have the right expectations. Listen to what it says talking about the disciples. Listen to what it says in Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 23. And this is talking about the disciples. It says, Then the mother of Zebedee's son came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked for a favor of him. What is it you want? He asked. This is Jesus speaking. What is it you want? She said, Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your kingdom. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? We can, they answered. Verse 23. Jesus said to them, You will indeed drink from the cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. And so there you see how they were wanting to be put on his left and his right side, those two brothers. Listen to what it says in Luke chapter 22, verse 24. Luke chapter 22, verse 24. Just trying to show you the attitude of some of these disciples. Luke chapter 22, verse 24. Notice what it says. It says, also a dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. And so they're sitting there arguing. This is the disciples. They're sitting there arguing about who's going to be the greatest among them. Which one of them is the greatest? And so that gives you a little bit of insight into how the disciples were. And so even though the disciples later, they became these great men of faith, that was after his death and his resurrection, they became these great men of faith. That's what they became later. But at this point in time, they weren't like that. And so they became these great men of faith, but they weren't always these great men of faith. There was a time they sat around arguing about who was going to be the greatest. There was a time where they had their mother asking Jesus to sit one of the brothers on the right and one on the left-hand side. And so they became great men of faith, but they weren't those great leaders in the beginning. And that's true about all of us. You know, when we first become Christians, we're not everything that we're going to be later. We might become those great men and women of faith later, but we don't start off that way. We grow into the process. And, you know, by us going to church and studying our Bible and fellowshipping with other believers, we begin to grow in God's grace. And then we can become those disciples that we should be, but we don't start off at that point. And so just like the disciples didn't start off there, but they did get there in the end, we're the same way. We don't start off there, but we can get there if we develop in our relationship with the Lord, when we will get there just like the disciples did. And so they were great men of faith, but they didn't start off at that point. And look down at verse 17 of John chapter 6. Notice what it says. It says, where they got into the boat and sat across the lake for Capernaum, but now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. So they got into the boat, sat across, and it was dark. So evidently Jesus had sent them off, but they came back to the shore at some point. They came back to the shore at a point Jesus had told them. But he had also given them instructions to leave that spot if he was not there by dark. And so Jesus had sent them away because the crowd was wanting to make him a king. And so he didn't want his disciples to get caught up in that. So he sent them away in the boat onto the lake. But they were to come back to that point, to a point that he had told them to pick Jesus up later. But evidently he had given them instructions. When you come back, if I'm not there, then you go on ahead without me. And so it was dark. He wasn't there. And so they were to go on ahead without him. So he wanted to get them away from trouble. And that's what we need to do sometimes. You know, that crowd, they were going to try to make him a king by force. And Jesus knew that. And so he got his disciples away from that situation so they couldn't get caught up in it. And sometimes that's exactly what you got to do. Sometimes there are situations develop, there are situations you could be around or getting caught up in that's not good for you. And the best thing you could do when that starts to happen is to just get away from it. Because it might not be your plan, it might not be your intentions to get caught up in some things, but just the fact that you're there could lead you to doing some things that you never thought you would do. And so be like these disciples, how Jesus had these disciples, he had them get away from the situation. Sometimes you just got to run. Sometimes you just got to get yourself away from certain situations so that you don't get caught up and do something that you might have thought I never would do that. But then you get caught up in the moment. So sometimes just get away like the disciples did. So he had them get away, but they were to come back later on to pick him up. But he wasn't there, and so they were to leave again once they left. And as they rode, and so they're leaving again, and as Jesus went up on the mountainside to pray, we saw that in Matthew. So as they rode, a storm came. And the distance from Bethsaida, that's where they were, that's where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, to Capernaum, that's where they were going. The distance is about 5 miles. And so they've got about 5 miles to go to get from one spot to another. And remember, this is not our day. 5 miles to us is nothing. We just get in our car and we go. But they didn't have these cars like we have to just get to where they wanted to. But they had to get from Bethsaida to Capernaum. Listen to verse 18. Verse 18 says, a strong wind was blowing and the water grew rough. And so they were going across this lake, they were going across the Sea of Galilee, and this strong wind began to blow as they were trying to make their way across the Sea of Galilee. Remember, it's dark, it's nighttime. And what caused the strong wind was the fact that the Sea of Galilee is about 600 feet below sea level. It's in a cup-like depression among the mountains. If you were to look at a map of this area, you'll see there are mountains on both sides of the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee is about 600 feet below sea level. And so you got these mountains on both sides, so you got like this cup there. And so with this cup, so they're in this sea, like at the bottom of this cup, and they're rowing. And when the sun sets, the air cools, and the cooler air from the west rushes down over the hillside, and the resultant wind churns the lake. Now, they were headed west, okay? They were headed west, going toward Capernaum. And as they're heading west, the wind rushes down out the mountains because it's getting cooler, and it's rushing down out the mountain toward the Sea of Galilee, which is where they were. And as that wind rushes down out the Sea of Galilee, because it's turning night, it churns up the water. And so the disciples were in this boat, and they were rowing against this wind that develops at nighttime because of how the situation of how the land is and how the mountains are. And since the disciples were headed west, they were making very little progress. They weren't making good progress. They're out there on the Sea of Galilee. They're in this boat. They're rowing. They didn't have a motorboat. The power they had was what they did with their arms. They're out there rowing in this boat, and they're rowing against the wind, going toward Capernaum. And because they're rowing against the wind, they're not making a whole lot of progress. And from Matthew, we know that they had been on the lake for a while. Listen to what it says in Matthew chapter 14. It's going to let us know they've been out there for a while. Matthew chapter 14, verse 25, it says, during the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. Notice it says during the fourth watch of the night. The fourth watch of the night is from about 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Somewhere in that time. We don't know exactly what time, but the fourth watch was from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So when Jesus came to them walking on the water, it's between 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so they had been out there for a while, because remember, they left when it began getting dark. And I don't know exactly what time it had been getting dark then, but they left the day before when it was starting to get dark. And they've left and they've been out there rowing in this boat all night. And so they've been rowing against this strong wind that was coming against them, trying to get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And they've been out there just rowing and rowing and rowing and rowing. And they weren't making good progress. I can imagine they were tired and, and they were probably just tired of rowing and just tired physically. But that's what was going on. It was early in the morning and they were still out there rowing. And notice verse 19, it says, when they had rowed 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and were terrified. And so they're about 3 to 3.5 miles out onto the Sea of Galilee. The wind is blowing against them. They're out there rowing. It's dark. It's nighttime. They're tired. And they're out there doing this. And as they're out there rowing and they're dark and tired, all of a sudden, as the Bible tells us, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. And notice what it says, and they were terrified. They're out there rowing in the dark, the wind is blowing against them, and they see somebody walking on them, walking toward the boat on water, and it says they become terrified. What do you think you would have done? You out there in this boat late at night, you've been rowing all night, you're not making good progress, and all of a sudden you see somebody walking towards your boat on water. Would you have been terrified? Well, I don't know if you would have been, but at least the disciples were terrified when they saw this. And the reason the disciples were terrified was because in their weakened state from rowing all night, the sight of Jesus looked like a ghost to them. They thought they saw a ghost. Listen to what it says in Matthew chapter 14, verse 26. Matthew verse 14, verse 26, what tells us more about this, it says, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. But then it gives us a little bit more. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. And so they saw Jesus walking on the water, but they didn't think it was Jesus. They thought it was a ghost. They were terrified because they thought it was a ghost coming toward them. And so we see that little detail in Matthew chapter 14, verse 26. And during the time of the disciples, during that time, a popular Jewish superstition held that the appearance of spirits during the night brought disaster. Okay? The appearance of spirits during the night, they had a superstition that some people believe that if you saw a spirit during the night, that meant disaster was about to come. Now think about it. Where are the disciples? They're out there rowing on this lake. They're out there rowing on the Sea of Galilee. It's somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. in the morning. They're tired. The wind is blowing against them. They're not making good progress. And now they see this person walking toward them. And in their mind, they're thinking, this could be a ghost. This could be a ghost coming out here toward us. And there was a superstition that if there was a ghost, then that wasn't a good thing. That the appearance of spirits during the night brought about disaster. And so that's what could have been going through their mind. The disciples' fear may have been prompted by the disciples' fear may have been prompted by what they may have thought was a water spirit. So they may have thought it was a water spirit. Even when one does not believe in such things, when the mind is tired, it would have you thinking you do. You ever been like that? You've been so tired from doing something that you even begin to believe in something that you don't really believe. You know it's not true. But yet, in that moment, because you're tired and your mind is not as strong as it should be, you believe something that you wouldn't ordinarily believe. Or, sometimes you go to a movie or you get in a situation, and in that situation, you know what's going on is not true, but yet sometimes you can still react to what you see on that movie screen, or you can react if you're at an amusement park. You can react to that fearful situation that they put you in, even though you know it's not true. And so the disciples are out there on this lake. They've been rowing all night. They're tired. The wind is blowing hard. They're not making good progress. They're just physically tired. And now they see somebody approaching them, walking on water. And they think about this superstition they've heard. Maybe the superstition they've grown up all their life. They've heard, if you see a spirit at nighttime, that means something bad is about to happen. And so they're out there and they see this person, they see this thing coming from, walking on the water toward them, and they could be thinking something bad is about to happen. And so they're in a situation where they're thinking nothing good is getting ready to happen to us. They're out there tired and they're thinking nothing good is getting ready to happen to us. But it wasn't a ghost, was it? But a ghost it was not. It was not. It was Jesus, and he sets them at ease. Notice what it says in verse 20. It wasn't a ghost, it was Jesus. Verse 20 of John chapter 6 says, "But he said to them, it is I, don't be afraid." This is Jesus speaking. It is I, don't be afraid. And when he got into the boat, the winds died down. Listen to what it says in Mark. It doesn't tell us here in John about that, but listen to what Mark says about how the winds died down. Mark chapter 6, verse 51. Mark chapter 6, verse 51, where he speaks about this miracle. Notice what he says. Then he climbed into the boat, talking about Jesus. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the winds died down. They were completely amazed. He climbed into the boat, talking about Jesus. Jesus climbed into the boat. The winds died down, and they were amazed. Remember, just moments before, they were out there and they were in fear. They were in fear because they were tired. They had had the wind blowing against them. They've been rowing all night. They might have had these superstitions in their head, and they might have been thinking something bad is getting ready to happen to us. And Jesus tells them in the midst of all of that, it is I. Don't be afraid. And not only that, he steps into the boat and the wind stops. Can you imagine that? You've been rowing against this wind all night. You've been rowing against it and you're tired from rowing against that wind. You're not making good progress. You're on this huge lake and you're trying to get across this lake. It's not some little small lake. It's this huge lake. You're trying to get across it. You're out there rowing. You see something coming towards you. You don't know what it is. You're fearful. You're afraid for your life. And then all of a sudden Jesus says, it is I. Don't be afraid. And not only that, he steps into the boat and the wind just stops. So Jesus, he's out there and he's in total control. And that's how it is. We can be in situations in life where we can be so fearful. We can be afraid of what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen. And yet we need to look to Jesus because he knows about what's going on with us. And he's going to take care of it. Might not take care of it the way you want him to, but he's going to take care of the situations. He knew about the disciples out there on that lake. He had been over there praying to the Father, and he had sent them out there on that lake to get to the other side. And so he knew what the situation was that they were in. And even though they were fearful, I can imagine if they thought back about it later, they really had no reason to fear because it was all under Jesus' control. And the same thing's true about us a lot of times. We're in situations, we can be fearful. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to turn out. We don't know what we should do. But we need to realize God knows what's going on. Jesus knows what's going on. And even though you're fearful, you have someone who knows what's going on. And he's going to take care of it. Just like Jesus says, it is I. Don't be afraid. He steps into the boat and the wind stopped blowing. And so when you get in those times in life where you're fearful, just turn to Jesus, turn to God, and realize that he has your back. He knows exactly what you're going through. He knows what's going on, and he's going to be there for you. And so we see Jesus had complete control of the situation, even over nature. Jesus had complete control of the situation, even over nature. Even though those winds were coming down that mountain, because with the way nature works, the way the system worked in that time, the way the weather system worked, when at nighttime the winds came down, and so, but yet Jesus had control over nature. Even though the nature was behaving one way, Jesus had power over that, and he told that wind to stop blowing, and it stopped blowing. And notice what it says in verse 21, how the boat, when that happened, the boat immediately reached the other side. Listen to what verse 21 says. Verse 20. Well, we saw that in Mark, how immediately they reached the other side. And it says, verse 21, notice going on, it says, they were willing to take him to the boat. And here it is. They were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the other shore where they were heading. And so they had been out there rowing. They saw Jesus coming. They became fearful because they were rowing against that wind. They were tired. Jesus said, "It is I." He said, "It is I." He climbed into the boat. The wind stopped blowing. And then it said immediately they reached the other shore where they were heading. And so everything was all right. They've been out there rowing. It's now somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning. They had been out there all night. Jesus gets into the boat. The wind stops. And immediately they get to the other side. Jesus had everything under control. There was no need for them to fear, because Jesus was going to keep everything all right. Same thing with you. You're going to find yourself in situations sometimes where you just don't know how it's going to turn out. But there's no need to worry, because Jesus has it all under his control. And here I want to end by mentioning two things. There are two possibilities. Remember how I said immediately they reached the other side? You know, there's two possibilities here of what happened. How did they reach the other side? There's two possibilities. One is the disciples are renewed by the presence of Jesus. Remember, they've been out there rowing all night, but now Jesus is there. And so they're renewed by the presence of Jesus. And the wind has died down. So the wind has stopped. Remember, he got in the boat, the wind stopped, and they've been renewed by his presence. And thus, it did not take them long to reach the other side. And so the first way that people think what might have happened was they've been out there, they've been tired. Now Jesus is with them. The wind has stopped. Now they've got more energy, and they're out there rowing. And they're out there rowing, and as they're out there rowing, because they've got that new energy, boom, you know, it seems like immediately they're over to the other side because they're renewed. So that's one possibility. And then others think that another miracle took place. You know, that would be that first option is, you know, they did it all on their own. The second is another miracle took place. For after such, because they think for after such a magnificent act of power, they find it hard to believe that Jesus would let the disciples continue to row. But rather, Jesus communicated to the boat, and immediately they reached the other shore. And so some people believe that another miracle was happening, that, you know, when Jesus got into the boat, Jesus just commanded, and immediately the boat got there. And so you got two different views of what people think. Some people think they just continued on with their rowing, but they were renewed by the fact that Jesus was there. They were renewed in their strength, and the wind had died down, and they just made it there through their own strength. And then others think, well, no, it was miraculous. You know, Jesus spoke to the boat, and it made it to the other side. Now, which way was it? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us which one of the two it was. But something we can learn from that is sometimes God is working, and he's working, and he's just going to have you do it. He's going to give you the strength to know it. He's going to renew your strength, and he's going to make that wind calm down. But you still got to do the rowing. He's there with you. He's there in the boat with you, but he still expects you to row. That's what God does sometimes. He expects you to just continue on. He's there with you, and he makes the way, but you got to continue on in doing those things you have to do. But then there are other times where God works miraculously. Sometimes God works in a miraculous way. He got in that boat, and like I said, we don't know which it is, and he just commanded, and the boat got to the other side. Sometimes he works like that. He works in a very miraculous way. Sometimes he works where you still got to do what you got to do. You never know how God's going to do it, but either way, he's in control. Sometimes he's giving you the strength. He's giving you the renewal for you to make it on your own, for you to make it. You know, you're depending on him, but he's giving you the strength. He's giving you the tools that you need to make it. That's how he works sometimes. And then sometimes he works miraculously. And so, but the important thing, which way it really happened in this case, that's not what's important. What's important is Jesus made a way for them to get there. What's important in those situations you face in your life is that Jesus makes a way for you to get through that situation. You don't know how it's going to be. You don't know, is he going to work miraculously, or is he just going to work through those ordinary means, that he's just going to give you some extra strength and let you get through it by just doing those things that you do. You never know how he's going to work, but he's going to be there for you. He's not going to leave you there by yourself. You just don't know how he's going to work it out. And so what we see in this verse is that Jesus is going to be there for you. Those storms of life, they're going to come. You're going to be out there in your own lake situation, in your own situation when you're on the Sea of Galilee. You're going to be tired. You're going to be thinking, well, what am I going to do now? I've been out here all night rowing, and we're getting nowhere on this big old lake. I'm just rowing, and I'm rowing, and I'm rowing. This wind is blowing against me. We're getting nowhere. You're going to be in situations like that. Might not be in a rowboat, but there's going to be a storm in your life. And what you got to do is you got to realize that Jesus is there with you. He knows about that storm you're in, and he's going to be there with you. He's not going to let you go through it by yourself. And so always remember that no matter what the storm is, no matter what the situation is, Jesus is there with you. And he has your best intentions and your best life in store for you. So you just got to keep on going and ask God to help you. Well, that's going to be it for the day. And so I guess what I want you to realize is that you always got to look to Jesus for the help that you need, even when you don't know how it's going to work out, even when you don't know how he's going to work in that situation. Always look to God. Always look to Jesus for the help that you need. And he's going to bring that help. Now, it might be like the disciples. We don't know which it was. It might be that you just got to keep on rowing, but he renews your strength. Or it might be that he works in a miraculous way. We don't know which way he's going to work in your situation, but we do know that he is going to work. Well, that's going to be it for today. Always look to Jesus for the help that you need. And we'll see you again next week. You have a blessed day. Bye now.